Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello and welcome to all of our listeners. My name is Michael Horn. I am the host for this program today. It's called I Thought You'd Like to Know This Too, and I'm honored to be with a great guest that we have today. His name is Rick Akins. He is just a wonderful witness to the gospel, and he was recently on another program that WCAT Radio produces. It's called Living the Gospel of Life, and it was about his new book called Challenge to Grow, and he was in that interview with Leticia Velasquez, and so he's familiar with our station. He's familiar with being on WCAT Radio, and I just want to read a quick bio of Rick for our listeners real quickly, just so you can have an idea of Rick's story thus far in life and what he has to offer for us tonight. So Rick Akins is a father of three, and he currently lives in Wheaton, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. He was born and raised Catholic in upstate New York and has an electrical engineering degree and an MBA from the University of Illinois. He has been widely published in the technology field and owns 6 patents in fiber optics. In 2004, he began attending an evangelical church every other weekend for family reasons and wrote several books about the experience in the evangelical church. His new book, Challenge to Grow, was released in mid-June of 2018 through New City Press. He has been very active in the fields of Catholic education and ecumenism for the past 5 years. So, Rick, thank you so much for being with us. How are you doing?
Doing real well, Michael. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent, excellent. And again, thank you for your recent interview with Leticia Velasquez on our program at WCAT called Living the Gospel of Life, and talking about your book, Challenge to Grow. Just as we kind of delve into the main topic of what we'll discuss today on your book called Nicodemus, which is a work of Catholic historical fiction, just want to give our listeners a little bit of background about how you began working in the areas of Catholic writing, apologetics, and ecumenism. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about how you got started working in those couple areas.
Sure. Well, being an electrical engineer and working in fiber optics was a perfect segue into writing, of course. So I kind of got into it by accident because in engineering college, we didn't take a single class in English or writing. So, but I was, as you said in the bio, born and raised Catholic, and thought I had a real good Catholic background. And for family reasons, about 13, 14 years ago now, my family began to split time between a Catholic church and opposite weekends with an evangelical church. And Wheaton is home of Wheaton College, so that's very heavily an evangelical area. And as I went through that process, there was a number of challenges that suddenly came up from the standpoint that I knew my Catholic faith because there's a wonderful selection of catechisms and teachings and so forth, what we believe. But suddenly I was faced with all these challenges from people who weren't Catholic, and not only weren't Catholic, but didn't really consider us to be Christian because we're Catholic. And so I went out and tried to find the answers for all these very specific questions that people brought up. And sometimes there were questions about the interpretation of a Bible verse or what we Catholics understand in our relationship with Mary, and on and on. And so as I went through that process, those kind of answers were not as easily found. So I began to write down what I had discovered and came up with initially just for my children. When they got out of high school and college, I wanted to give them something that they could look at and say, well, hey, here's why my dad remained Catholic and why my dad still is open to, talk to and have relationships with non-Catholics. And step by step, that turned into sending the book into the diocese to get the permission to publish, and then that was picked up last year by New City Press and finally came out in June of this year.
Awesome. Very cool, very cool. And yeah, I mentioned that was recently the topic of an interview that you gave with Leticia Velasquez on Living the Gospel of Life. Do you have any reflections that you'd like to share about that interview, how that went, or any insights that you kind of gained through that experience? If not, it's fine, but I just wanted to see if there's anything that you would like to comment on from that initial interview that you had recently.
No, it was very interesting because as I've actually written 3 books that have permission to publish at this point, and I'm looking for a market for the second and third one. But our diocesan censor, who's the theological expert that has to review these books, is also in charge of our ecumenical program. And as he read the books, he came to me and said, you really should be involved with our ecumenical programs because you're very strong in your Catholic faith, but you're not trying to beat down people who are not Catholic, and you're trying to build bridges. And in my interview with Leticia, the interesting thing was, her focus is on the life issues, and we had a nice discussion about the fact that non-Catholic Christians, it's a very good way for us to build bridges with them is to focus on the good work that the Catholic Church does in the areas of life, abortion issues and so forth. And those are areas that a lot of Protestants and evangelicals are very interested in, but they don't have the structure and the theology behind it that we Catholics do. So it was really interesting to have that discussion with her and kind of point out again how we can kind of lead the way in that area and break down a lot of barriers between ourselves and other Christian denominations.
Sure. Awesome. Excellent. Yeah, so you touched on a little bit of kind of the goals of your nonfiction writing and your work with kind of that triad of Catholic teaching, apologetics, and also ecumenism, which is fantastic. And so you mentioned that New City Press published this Challenge to Grow book that you've released. And could you just tell us a little bit about their story, about New City Press? Anything going on there? Yeah,
it's a really fascinating story. There was a group of young women, teenagers really, back in World War II, and they lived in the town of Trent, which was the Council of Trent happened there in the mid-1500s, and they were unfortunately between the Germans and Allied forces for quite a while, and there was a number of almost nightly bombings going on in the city. So each day they would get up and they'd leave their houses and they'd go out and they'd try to serve the people who had been injured or people didn't have any food and so forth. And a lot of times they would bring them back to this one particular house and they would all kind of congregate in front of the fireplace to keep warm at night. And so there were 4 or 5 girls who started this, and when the war ended, the leader of that group started a congregation, became a sister, and started a congregation called the Focolare. And Focolare is the Italian word that means the hearth, and they were trying to say, hey, we welcome everybody in, and we as Catholics are going to serve you and build bridges and build community around this hearth. And so currently there's somewhere around 130,000 people around the world who are involved with this group in one way or another. And some of them are simply, people who support that group. Some of them are actually in Chicago. There's a kind of a women's house. They're not sisters, but they're a group of women who live in one home near University of Chicago, and they live out the gospel together and reach out to the people in that community. And then west of Chicago, there's a house where there's 9 or 10 men who live together, who are all professionals in one area or another, but they're trying to live out their Catholic lives in a very special way. So the Focolare have a couple of publishing houses. One of them is called New City Press. So they publish, they're based in New York and publish about 10 or 12 books a year. What they're really famous for is they did an exhaustive publication of all of St. Augustine's works. So that's kind of their claim to fame. But they're a great group of people, to work with. I've got to know the local people here very well over the years.
Awesome. Excellent. Okay, and as we move kind of into today's discussion on your book, Nicodemus, this upcoming novel of Catholic historical fiction, could you tell us a little bit about the work overall and why you chose to get into the fiction category in your writing?
Well, I spent a lot of time working on the nonfiction books. So the first one came out this year. There's a second one that talks very much about the biblical text that some non-Catholics use to kind of beat up on Catholics. And then the third one was a look at the Reformation period. And I've gotten a lot of interest in those. I've done a number of seminars for parishes and so forth. But not a big surprise. There's a large group of people out there in any field who just simply will not read nonfiction books. You know, they're more into the novels and reading those type of things. And I had long tried to think through how do you put some of the great Catholic stories into novel form and make it entertaining for people as well as getting some information across. So when you look at a documentary on Catholicism, you get a certain amount of information, but when you watch The Passion of the Christ, you get something totally different and very powerful in a lot of ways. So that got me interested in looking at trying to write something in the fiction side. So this first book is called Nicodemus, and there's a set of 4 books in the series that talk about, the other ones talk about the Apostle Andrew, talks about St. Augustine, talks about the Apostle Bartholomew. But the first one is about Nicodemus, who we all remember is, in that very famous nighttime discussion with Jesus, where Jesus tells him that to be saved, you need to be born again. So, of course, from my time in the evangelical church, that's a huge focus. That, you listen to a lot of Protestants, that's kind of their mantra, right? They're born-again Christians. So that all goes back to that one discussion in John chapter 3. And so I had always been interested in him and in his story. But then one day when it was right after Christmas 2 years ago, and I was listening to a homily at Mass, and the discussion was about the Pharisees and scribes who went before King Herod. And this was after Jesus was born, and the 3 wise men come and ask King Herod where the new king of the Jews is going to be born. So Herod calls in the Jewish leadership and asks them, and then based on their information, he sends his troops out to Bethlehem, and they slaughter all the kids. And as I'm listening to the homily, I'm thinking, what must it have been like for the actual scribes and Pharisees who told them this information, and then find out, a couple days later that Herod went out and killed all these young boys because of what they said. And that really kind of triggered my thought that here's Nicodemus, he's a Pharisee, and what if he was the guy that did this? And what kind of guilt would he have lived through the rest of his life? So that's kind of the starting point to the book, Nicodemus.
Sure. Okay, very cool, very cool. So that's the theme kind of the book, and I like the intentionality, like you're talking about. A lot of people that kind of just refuse to read nonfiction these days, and to kind of tailor that to that specific audience there, and to kind of use the imagination to explore biblical truths and stuff in a different way and in a unique approach. So that's fantastic. And so would you say that this book is, in fact, Catholic, or is it written for a broader audience?
It's not purposely dumbed down at all, from the standpoint that I talk about several Catholic themes in the book, but they're always told in a way that I'm not purposely trying to go out there and tell non-Catholics, hey, don't read this, or if you read this, you're going to have to turn into a Catholic, because in the end, a fiction book's only going to work if it's a really good fiction book. So it can't be the one that a lot of people know about on the fiction side from Protestants was the Left Behind series. And there's some good stories in there from the standpoint that it's an interesting story on its own. But in there, you also have times where it gets a little bit preachy, and a lot of books end up being like that if you're writing about religious issues. And this one, can't avoid that from the standpoint that it is talking about the two lead characters are Nicodemus and John the Apostle. So I can't talk about John the Apostle without saying that, talking about what happened to him with Jesus and in our biblical stories. But I don't try to tie that together to a certain theological point to say only Catholics have this right, and here's why. Because now I try to make John say it the way a Catholic would interpret a particular part of the faith. But I'm always trying to focus on, in the end, it's got to be an interesting story, because otherwise nobody's going to read it at that point. So I would say it's definitely Christian. It's a work that starts in 70 AD, right before the temple is destroyed by the Romans, and it is an account of John and Nicodemus's relationship. And what kind of got me interested in John's part of it was that there's only 4 recorded verses in the Bible that talk about Nicodemus, and they're all in John's gospel. So I'm trying to use my imagination a little bit to say, why did that happen? Obviously John must have talked to this Nicodemus at some point. So it gets into that relationship.
Right. Very cool. So you mentioned John and Nicodemus as the main characters. Could you talk a little bit about kind of some minor characters and also some of the Catholic themes that you do present in this book? Like you said, it's obviously not just exclusively for Catholics, but can you talk a little bit about, like I said, the minor characters that make appearances, and then also just kind of some of the themes that are kind of presented to the forefront in this work?
Sure. The main part of the story is that Nicodemus, and what made it hard to write the story is that the driving force behind the drama is that the Romans are coming to Jerusalem to destroy the temple. And Nicodemus and his family live right outside the temple because he's one of the Pharisees. But the problem was Nicodemus, if you run the numbers back, had to be at least in his 30s or 40s when Jesus was crucified, or in my story at least, if he's going to be old enough to be the one to tell Herod when Jesus, or where Jesus was supposed to be born, then at the crucifixion he has to be close to 50 years old, which now means he's in his 80s during the time of the actual story. But that actually helped out because it's told from his point of view, but because he's an old man now, he is living with his daughter and his granddaughter, who had both been not martyred, but widowed by the Romans, who killed both of their husbands. So we have a really nice 3-generation family dynamic going on at the same time. And it's really very interesting because the granddaughter is interested in the Christian ideas that are percolating around Jerusalem. But the mother, Nicodemus' daughter, is very traditional, and she's she's traditional because she's trying to defend her father also, who despite all his interfaces with John, has remained staunchly Jewish over the years. So it's an interesting dynamic back and forth from that standpoint within the family as well, which then drives the drama because we have to find out what happens now when the Romans attack and basically slaughter everybody in Jerusalem and sack the temple.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so in this work, obviously you're using your imagination, but you're also exploring kind of the context of the Jewish world at a time, at the beginning of the early church, so the Jewish world in the decades after Jesus, while you're researching kind of how can we present various themes, how can we kind of present characters, look at John and Nicodemus' relationship in a different way, and just to kind of explore that whole context and setting. So what were some of the things that you learned while you were exploring this context and the history of the Jewish world during this time after Christ?
Yeah, so the 2 things that interested me the most, one was from a theological standpoint, one was from a historical standpoint. And we're talking about essentially the end of the Jewish people from the standpoint that the Romans came in 70 AD and completely destroyed everything that they knew, as far as their temple, their way of life, the Pharisees, and everything they had in their capital city. And just the brutality of the attack that the Romans portrayed, and it's a little bit different in the book because of the book format. In real life, there was a long sack or siege of the city first. In the book, it happens fairly quickly during Passover week. And but what was very interesting are all the small details. Like they had a gate on the temple that a lot of the pilgrims would come in for Passover, and the gate was, to all intents and purposes, everybody thought the gate was metal. So how did the Romans get through it? Well, it wasn't really metal. It was just gilded in silver. So they came with a battering ram, knocked all the silver off, and then lit the wood door inside on fire. And that's how they got into the temple. So there's little details like that I find really fascinating as far as how that goes. And then from a theme standpoint, my interest for a long time has been we have 4 gospel accounts, and you have the 3 synoptics, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're very similar, right? They're very, and that's why they're called synoptics. They're very much a biography of Jesus' life, more focused on what he did, where he went at different times, and they're all basically chronological from his birth leading to his crucifixion. John comes in about 30 years later and writes the 4th gospel, and it's a very different format than the other 3. And so I'm trying to figure out in the book, why does John come back to talk to Nicodemus right at this point at AD 70? And the clear reason was that Paul and Peter had just been martyred within the previous 2 years. So in my mind, in this book, John's the last of the apostles. He's the last of the eyewitnesses. And he must have been under enormous strain to try to, and pressure from the believers to write down everything he knew at that time before his memories were lost as well. And so he goes and finds out or finds Nicodemus because he knows Nicodemus has firsthand experience with Jesus, and he wants to get his information as well and his view on what Jesus meant. Because you get this incredible beginning to the Gospel of John that talks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that's an unbelievably dramatic start to his gospel account. And so those are the type of themes that I was trying to focus on in this book. And then the second theme is that he is, by this point in real life, John had been living in Ephesus. Most of his followers in the Christian churches in those areas were Gentiles. So he's also very keen through his writing to try to figure out how to explain why Jews and Gentiles could now come back and be in one family of Christ together. So that's the other part, and that's a nice dynamic because that's exactly what Nicodemus just could not accept throughout his life, was why these Gentiles are now becoming part of the family, and it's looking like the Jews are being left behind because he's remaining Jewish, fully Jewish in every aspect of his life. So those are the major themes of the book as we go through it.
Sure, awesome. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is this part of kind of a series that you're producing? Is that right? A book?
Yeah, what I basically I have the drafts for the second and third book are done at this point. It's called the Foundations series, and it's basically talking about trying to put a human face on some of the characters that we don't really see very much of in the Bible. So we know that Andrew, for example, is one of the apostles. What I'd never really thought about until I started writing these books was, Andrew's actually the older brother of Peter. So in that environment, in that Jewish world, with all their respect for their elders, it must have been kind of a slap in the face for Jesus to pick Peter as the leader of the apostles and not Andrew. So that's the overriding theme of that book, is his pride and how does he overcome that pride. And then the third book is about Bartholomew, who is sometimes called Thaddeus in the Bible as well. but he's a very minor character. And what I was trying to get across is we know some things about him and about the other apostles who aren't very well represented in the biblical text. We know what they did through the tradition of the church, and I'm trying to put a little bit more of a face to that. And what I remember very clearly, a fiction book called I, Judas, and it was about Judas, and it was a first-person account from his standpoint. And, of course, you don't read these fiction works and think that you're going to get complete, orthodox, recitation of biblical text and so forth. But it was very interesting. There was a couple of points in there that the author brought up that were things that I had never thought about before, and it kind of gives you more of a close relationship with Jesus, I think, when you actually consider that he was a real person with real friends, and they did real human things together for all the time that they were together. So those are some of the concepts I'm trying to get across with this first book, Nicodemus, and then that series of books.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And so you mentioned that you're going to try to do one on Bartholomew, and then you said something about Thaddeus after it. Do you mean like separate works, so Bartholomew or Nathaniel on one, and then Jude Thaddeus, or
right?
One?
So there's exactly two books. So there's a couple of different. I don't want to call them minor apostles, but apostles who are not. We don't see very much of them in the gospel account. So we read a couple of lists of the apostles, so we get their names in there. Part of the problem too is that back then a lot of people kind of were referred to by multiple names at different times. But it's interesting to me to consider you're one of the 12 apostles. I mean, you're one of the foundation members of the church, and you spent time face to face with Jesus for up to a couple of years, and it'd be interesting to kind of project what kind of stories they might have in their lives. How did they treat the fact that Jesus kind of separated out James and John and Peter for certain times, where they went on the Mount of Transfiguration, for example? What did the rest of the apostles think about when they were waiting down in the valley below the hillside? So those are kind of themes that you don't want to come across as if you have, this is not like I have some revelation from God personally that this is what happened, but it's a work of fiction that hopefully will find an audience and have people interested in getting a little more detail about what life was like in general back then and how Jesus' life affected different people.
Sure. Now, this Foundation series, you mentioned there's these various characters that are kind of not as well known in the Gospels, these minor apostles, like you said, people that we hear about but perhaps don't get a full picture or story on, and kind of their interactions with Jesus and what that might have been like. Is there a progression or some sort of pattern or sequence in the series, or is it just kind of based on these characters, and it's just like it's not like you have to read one before the other or anything like that? How is it kind of set up? How do you have the order of these works?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first started them, I thought, well, I need to make it so that if in Nicodemus, John says that the apostles did X, Y, Z at this time frame, it needs to say the same thing in the other books. But then I got, as I started to write the second and third books, when those points of commonality happen, they're very interesting. But I don't try to force it, because then if you force it, then all of a sudden you could tell that you're changing the story just where it's not a good story anymore, but you're changing it just so that it fits in some overall timeline. So they don't really coincide with the same timeline at all, other than the parts that we actually know about in the historical record. But they're basically focusing on different themes. So Andrew's theme is pride and arrogance, and being able eventually for him to understand Christ and how Christians are supposed to be humble. So that's kind of his overall overarching theme. And Nicodemus's overarching problem is that he feels like he he was the cause of the death of all these young children when right after Jesus was born. So he's carried that guilt along with him his whole life. And then after the sack of the temple, his anger builds up. Even at his age, his anger builds up against the Romans. So now he is faced with the need to be forgiven himself. At the same time that he knows he's being asked to forgive these Romans. So that's the overall theme of Nicodemus, is that reconciliation and that being able to find forgiveness for yourself as well. So each book has that type of theme going on, and then I try to tie each one into the actual historical narrative of what was happening. For example, we know where Andrew went and where he was martyred, so carrying that story out, like how did he get to where we know he ended up, and what might that effort of someone like him splitting off from the other 12 apostles and going basically to the mission fields and trying to tell the story of Jesus to people who weren't even from a Jewish background, much less a Christian background. So those are the type of stories we're trying to get across in this series.
Sure. Great. So when you talk about these books, Rick, is it pretty universal as far as like age range, or what are you thinking, or like the target? Because like we mentioned about how there's certainly Catholic themes, but it's very applicable to most people out there. But would you say there's a like preferential age range on this, or not so much?
Well, I would say they're young adult and adult level books. Sure. I'm hoping that the story is interesting enough that a person in high school or college would pick it up and read it, even if they're not fully engaged in theology and the church and so forth. It doesn't have there's no profanity or anything like that in the books, but there is in Nicodemus, for example. The Romans come in and sack the city, so to a certain extent you have to show that. I didn't dive into try to make it real graphic or anything of that nature, but it's probably not for an 8-year-old or 10-year-old. Sure. But I think as people progress in age, they do start to think more about the questions that should come up to most of us as Christians when we read the Bible or when we hear the stories of Jesus' birth or his time at the temple when he was a young man, when Mary and Joseph had to come back to find him. When those things happen, we only have a sentence or two in the Bible to think about, and it's, I think, pretty important for us to think a little more than that and try to put ourselves maybe not right there, but at least think through what must have it had been like for Jesus, because he was truly man and truly God at the same time. And the people around him, I think the biggest and most amazing thing is that even after the resurrection, that anybody could actually wrap their head around it, he just came back from the dead, and this is the things that he's teaching us at this point. So it's just an amazing time period, I think, and one that clearly comes before a lot of the divisions that have plagued the church over the last 500 years. So I think it would be nice for all Christians to go back and be able to read some stories about that time period. Right.
Very good. Very good. And so just kind of back to the beginning part of the interview, we talked a little bit about kind of ecumenism and certainly the role of apologetics, but also being balanced in the sense that we must kind of explore the things and the issues, the topics, the doctrines that divide Protestants and Catholics. But how would you describe kind of the general climate or status of current ecumenical efforts, kind of maybe in your personal life or in general in the church, whatever? What are some thoughts that you have on kind of the works and efforts for ecumenism within the church?
Well, I'll start with a general view from my perspective, which obviously is limited. But the concern I hear over and over again from the Catholic side is the feeling that people that are involved with ecumenism are somehow watering down our faith, from the standpoint that we're not going to be able to build bridges with somebody else if we keep believing what we believe. We have to basically overlook a lot of the stuff that we believe, like the real presence of the Eucharist or whatever it is, so that other people aren't angry at us anymore. And I do a lot of parish events and talks, and I'm part of the Knights of Columbus, and I do a talk every month for them. And that's one of the first things I reassure everybody is that in my few years of involvement on the ecumenical process, when you water down your faith, that's the kiss of death, because people on the other side, they're not going to change their mind about you because you're wishy-washy. They're going to actually look down upon that because they want to deal with Catholics who actually know their faith and are willing to defend their faith. But you defend your faith in a way that's respectful to the other person. And I think from a Catholic standpoint, what the beauty for us in the ecumenical process is that if you read the Catechism, the Church has gone a long way to reach out to Protestants, and specifically, there's a paragraph in the 2 paragraphs in the Catechism that are key to that. One says that any person that's validly baptized into the Trinity is validly baptized, from the Catholic standpoint, that they're actually part of our church. They may not be engaged in our church. They may not believe all the rest of the things that we teach. They may not even want to be told that they're part of the church. But from our standpoint, we accept them as fellow Christians. And it doesn't mean that we can't try to tell them that the fullness of truth in our mind is in the Catholic faith, but we don't sit there and say that they're damned forever because they don't believe exactly what we believe. And then the second paragraph in the Catechism talks about the fact that those who are born into the Protestant faith, they don't have the personal sin of leaving the Catholic faith. So it's one thing, that we'll leave up to God to decide what to do with people like Martin Luther or whoever who actively split away from the church. But the people who come along 200 years later and think that they're serving God by remaining Lutheran or Presbyterian or whatever else, they're not guilty of a sin simply because they were born into that family. So I think those two are really comforting for me, because then I can go and talk to all these non-Catholic Christians and really treat them as fellow Christians, as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ that we're trying, that we want the best for. As far as the progress goes, I would just tell people, if they're interested, there was a 1993 document called Declaration, the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, and that was between Catholics and Lutherans. And it basically put aside or put away a lot of the debate that started the Reformation period 500 years ago, specifically in the area of how are we justified before God. And then there was a second document that came out not too long ago called the Declaration on the Way, and that was signed by Catholics and Lutherans, and that one basically has 33 points of agreement. So it's divided between the structure of the church, the purpose of the ministry, and the Eucharist. And in those three, without watering down our faith, and I would say without watering down the Lutheran faith either, we're saying here are our 33 points that we are in agreement on. So those type of things are amazing steps of progress in terms of ecumenism. And those are the ones that I'm personally aware of, because I know there's other ones with the Eastern Orthodox churches that are progressing pretty well now at the same time. So I'm very optimistic moving forward that God's working within the churches in some special ways right now to try to bring us back a little bit more into a position of unity with each other. And then from a personal standpoint, I know there's a lot of groups that I'm involved with around the Chicagoland area of just grassroots people coming up who are a combination of Catholics and around here mostly evangelicals who are at the point of saying, we're not going to put up with this this anger that we have and mistrust we have for each other anymore. We're not going to come into our churches and say, if we're an evangelical, that all Catholics are doomed, so we're going to try to convert them, and vice versa. So we're trying to build relationships, as the Catechism says. You build relationships by understanding your own faith first and living it out, and then teaching the other person the truths of your faith, because there's so much misinformation out there that causes half the problems. And then you try to reach out to your fellow Christian through works of charity and good works in the community, to try to build something that you can work on together with the other person.
Sure. Very well said, Rick, about ecumenism and our efforts in that realm. I appreciate those thoughts. Now, just back to Nicodemus real quick, the work in this series here. How do you think this work, something like Nicodemus and the other books that you have in that Foundation series about kind of looking at various characters and kind of presenting these different truths and about the work of historical fiction, in a sense of taking real characters from the Bible and presenting these ideas to convey themes, how do you think that plays a role in kind of helping with the ecumenical movement, if you think it does?
I think in Nicodemus especially, the fact that part of it is explaining how John got to the point of writing his gospel the way he wrote it, and seeing what his themes were. And I'm convinced that his theme in his gospel, as well as Paul's themes in most of his writing, especially the book of Romans, the basic theme they're trying to get across was that Jesus is the Savior of not just the Jews, but of the Gentiles as well. And if you think about it, they're trying to bring people into one family who literally, a year before would not sit down, would not even enter the same room with each other. And you have people on the Jewish side who, like Nicodemus, who certainly must have felt like, hey, we and our ancestors have served God for 1,000 years and sacrificed all this for God, and now you're telling us that these Gentiles can come in and be saved just like we can? I mean, that must have been a real slap in the face. And vice versa, the Gentiles, they must have been thinking, well, you're asking us to follow this God of Jesus, or Jesus as God, who's the same God who chose the Jews and abandoned our ancestors for the last 1,500 years. And they must have been really kind of in a position where they didn't know whether that was the right thing to do or not. And I think you see that conversation happening all the time in the New Testament, which is they're trying to make the point that the Jews can be saved if they follow Jesus, just like the Gentiles can be saved if they can follow Jesus. And so in this book, I try gently in a couple areas when John's trying to figure out how to write something in this gospel, or how to get across what Jesus meant to him. And he's coming from a Christian, new Christian standpoint, and Nicodemus is still coming from a Jewish mindset. And that back and forth clarifies the issue on both sides, I think, for both of the men. And so that's what I'm trying to get across for Christians who read the books, especially Nicodemus, whether they're Catholic or not, is that when Christians today try to make the point that just us, just our little denomination or just our little group are the only ones that God loves, and the other Christ followers are not Christian at all, I think that flies right in the face of what the New Testament writers were trying to get across.
Very good. Thank you, Rick. And so I just want to remind our listeners real quickly, if you're just tuning in now, that this is the segment I Thought You'd Like to Know This Too, and I am with Rick Akins, and my name is Michael Horn. I'm hosting the show today, and Rick is talking about his book called Nicodemus, which is part of the Foundations series. It's a work about Nicodemus from the New Testament and his relationship with John the Apostle, and the process of their friendship, of John kind of talking to Nicodemus about his relationship with Christ, and also Nicodemus as a Jew, a devout Jew, especially during the time, having to deal with his struggles, certainly of being a Pharisee, and then realizing the power of Christ and the authenticity of the gospel message, and that Jesus is indeed Lord and Savior as he came into the world. And so Rick has kind of talked to us a little bit so far about his work with this book, Nicodemus, a historical fiction account per se, with looking at the scriptures and basing the writing on true characters, but also certainly using his powerful and vivid imagination to kind of imagine what different scenarios would look like in this time during Christ's life and shortly after, in that period of kind of the new church as it was forming after Pentecost and such. And so we're blessed to have Rick with us this evening. Rick, I just want to also ask you if there's anything, any other thoughts that you might have on this work. And you mentioned kind of the role that it has with ecumenism and our ecumenical efforts today, and how you've kind of tried to convey the truthful message about salvation for the Gentiles that Paul talks about a lot in his writings. And you talk about kind of the value of Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians coming together on the points that they do agree on, and also realizing the value of both sides in ecumenical dialogue and such, and trying to grow in relationship with Christ and with one another through it. I'm just wondering if you have any other kind of concluding thoughts on your work, Nicodemus, on the series Foundations, or any of the other kind of ecumenical efforts that you've kind of taken on in your life. Any kind of closing thoughts with this?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I find interesting, as we talked about earlier, is there's a lot of people who will not be helped by a lot of the nonfiction books that are out there, because even like the one that I came out with in June, because they just are not interested in nonfiction books. And I know this for a fact because I had some author copies when the book first came out, so I gave them to my 3 kids, and of course I could tell from the covers that 2 of my 3 kids have not opened the book up yet, and so I'm very aware of the fact that when there is a huge group of our population who are probably going to be brought closer to some of the words and some of the stories about Jesus through works of fiction. And that was, I think, completely evident a few years back when the Passion of the Christ came out, because that it was, for me, watching that was so moving, and it brought out things that, emotions and things of what happened to Jesus and Mary that you read about briefly every year, and it just becomes to the point where you don't really think deeply about it. But being able to see it, it made it much different impact. And I'm hoping that in these fiction books, who are targeted for everybody from high school up, I think this gives them an idea and an opportunity to think about Jesus as a real person. And there's a couple of quotes in there from the Bible. Maybe these are the first time some of these, some of the readers actually read those citations from the Bible, but they read it not as rote theology, but as part of the story. So they're where John's trying to figure out, and Nicodemus are trying to figure out what that relationship is now between Gentile and Jew, and a Jewish person in the character of John, who loves his Jewish people still, but has left them behind to start this new Christian church, and his relationship with a person completely opposite in Nicodemus, who needs Jesus and needs his forgiveness as much as anyone in his life, but has refused that throughout his life because he thinks he's still serving God properly by remaining Jewish and remaining separate from the Gentiles. And I think if we get some readers who see that, and maybe that makes an impact on them in a fiction story that they may not otherwise get, I think the purpose of these books is well served by that.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And so, Rick, it's been a pleasure to be with you. I don't have any more questions, and like I asked for your closing thoughts, and that's fantastic. And so we are a little bit under the hour time, but I think it's been certainly a very substantial and edifying interview today, and I think we've provided our listeners with a lot of great information about your book called Nicodemus. I ask you maybe to just let us know what the best and quickest way to get this book is currently. So how do we order Nicodemus? So
I have a website called fundamentallycatholic.com, So that that would be the best way to get more information on the book. Challenge to Grow is available currently on that website, as well as the New City Press website at newcitypress.com, and also on Amazon and books, Barnes & Noble, online stores and so forth. And as the fall progresses, we'll get closer to a publication date on Nicodemus, and I'll be able to get more information out at that point. But the background information on the book, both fiction and nonfiction, is on www.fundamentallycatholic.com. And that was a website name specifically picked because I was knee-deep in the evangelical world, and a lot of evangelicals call themselves fundamentalists. And as I started doing more and more research, I realized that, an objective view of the Catholic Church is that we were the fundamental Christian church, obviously started by the apostles and moving forward. So I'm trying to bridge a gap there as well. But I hope that everybody can join us on that website, sign up for our newsletter. We've got some online courses that are offered for free, and then hopefully they can join us for Nicodemus and the other books in the Foundation series.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rick. Yeah, so just a reminder to our listeners, if you check out fundamentallycatholic.com, you can find a lot of the kind of programs and endeavors that Rick has taken on. And like he said, Challenge to Grow is already up there, and he'll have this part of the Foundation series called Nicodemus up shortly. And you can just check out that website to explore kind of the work that he's doing and any other things that you'd like to check out with his books and his blog and anything else going on the website there. So I want to just thank all our listeners for tuning in today to our segment on I Thought You'd Like to Know This Too. It's been a pleasure being with you. Again, my name is Michael Horn, and I've been with Rick Akins. Rick, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your reflections, your thoughts on your new work, and thank you so much for your efforts for the sake of ecumenism within the church. I appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you, Michael. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
All right. Thanks, Rick. And we'll sign off, and we'll see you all next time on I Thought You'd Like to Know This Too. God bless you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.